Zero facts about the Titanic that shed light on the mystery of this catastrophe. A searchlight beam pierces the darkness over the waters of the Atlantic. The Titanic calmly cuts through the waves and its passengers sleep. Suddenly, in the light, a monstrous white outline appears. The fateful iceberg is about to tear the hull of the legendary ship. April 14, 1912. Just 2 days earlier, someone photographed a giant iceberg with a rather unusual elliptical shape. This iceberg, most likely, formed from snow that fell about 100,000 years ago. Scientists used computer modeling to determine its origin. They took data from 1912, added new information about winds and ocean currents, and concluded that this iceberg was probably part of a small cluster of icebergs in southwestern Greenland. Today, the path of such icebergs can be calculated for any time in the past. So, the infamous piece of ice was heading from Greenland to an area located south of Cornwall. If the ship had passed there just 2 days later, the iceberg would have moved significantly from the place where they met. Initially, the weight of the iceberg was 75 million tons. Then it began to melt slowly. By the time the Titanic sank, the weight of the iceberg was only 1.5 million tons. By the time of the collision, it had been melting for several months, but it was still a real monster. At the time of the impact with the Titanic, the iceberg was 120 meters long, and more than 30 meters of its surface was above the water. Some believe that the Titanic sank due to a supermoon. That night, a rare lunar event occurred, the likes of which had not happened in 1400 years. Under normal conditions, the iceberg would not have drifted so far south without melting and losing most of its mass. But the supermoon could have caused an unusually high tide, which broke the iceberg off the ice field much faster than usual. There is a type of bacteria that slowly consumes the remains of the Titanic. Salt corrosion, ocean currents, low temperatures, plus these microorganisms can consume all the wreckage. An American actress, Dorothy Gibson, was on board the Titanic. She survived, and when she arrived in New York, she immediately began filming a movie called Saved from the Titanic. The film was released just a month after the Titanic sank. In the film, the actress wore the same clothes and shoes as during the disaster. The film was a great success at the time, but the only known copy was destroyed in a fire. 14 years before the Titanic disaster, a novella called Futility was published. It seemed to predict this event. The plot told of a fictional ship, the Titan, which sank during its voyage. It was almost the same size as the Titanic, and both ships were described as unsinkable and had an insufficient number of lifeboats. The Titan also sank in April. The cause was also a collision with an iceberg. There was also love on the Titanic, not just in the movie. 13 couples were even on their honeymoon trip on the Titanic. One of the couples owned Macy's department store in New York. When it became clear that the Titanic was sinking, the woman refused to get into the lifeboat without her husband, who did not want to leave the ship while there were still women and children on board. Then her husband insisted that his maid take her place in the lifeboat and gave her his coat to keep her warm until help arrived. Some believe that the Titanic sank not because of an iceberg, but because of a mummy. It all started around the year 1000 BC with a mysterious woman who lived in Egypt, in the city of Waram. Little was known about her, but she was called a priest. Her mummy was placed in a wooden sarcophagus and covered with a large lid with an image of her face and some mysterious inscriptions. This place remained untouched until the first half of the 19th century when a group of locals accidentally stumbled upon it. No one knows how, but that same day the mummy mysteriously disappeared. A few decades later, a group of wealthy friends from England went to Egypt. They found the empty sarcophagus of the mummy with the image of the priestess, whose dark eyes seemed to stare into the void, and decided to buy it. But the buyer disappeared that same night, and all members of the group had various misfortunes. The sarcophagus was moved several times until, as some believe, it ended up on the Titanic. It took underwater robot explorers more than 70 years to find the remains of this legendary ship. The sunken vessel lies at a depth of 4 kilometers below the surface of the Atlantic, split in two. Why the liner broke is still unknown. Some believe it happened due to water entering during the collision with the iceberg. The strong pressure simply split the ship in two, starting from the bottom. Others think the hull rivets are to blame, which contained a lot of slag or smelting residues, making the metal very brittle. The ship had many design flaws, starting with the design. The watertight bulkheads were not fully sealed at the top, allowing water to fill all compartments and eventually sink the ship. The metal of the rivets and the steel of the hull became unusable due to high sulfur content, low temperatures, and high speeds. The steel shattered, and the rivets simply popped out. This caused the Titanic to sink 24 times faster than it should have. And if the iceberg had hit the bow of the ship instead of the side, it might have stayed afloat. Why didn't the crew have binoculars? This would certainly have helped them spot the iceberg in time and avoid the disaster. But the binoculars on the Titanic were locked in a storage compartment. The key was only with one crew member who had been transferred from the ship just before it set sail. Later, the man said he simply forgot to hand over the key. But even without binoculars, the crew had time to change course and avoid a collision if they had received a warning. However, it did receive a warning. Somewhere an hour before the disaster, the steamer Californian, which was quite close to the Titanic, sent a message that it had stopped due to a dense ice field. But the warning never reached the Titanic's captain. Some experts say it was the radio operator's fault. He did not understand the urgency of the message. And later, the sailors of the Californian said they did not receive distress signals from the Titanic because their radio operator was resting. Some experts say the crew of the Titanic failed to spot the iceberg in time due to an optical illusion. The atmospheric conditions that night could have caused a super refraction that masked the iceberg. Because of this, it was simply not visible until it was too close and the collision was inevitable. Less than a minute passed between the moment the iceberg was spotted and the collision. Just 37 seconds. And after 2 hours and 40 minutes, the Titanic disappeared forever in the waters of the ocean. There was panic, tears, and heart-wrenching farewells. Dreams and hopes were shattered when the collision with the iceberg destroyed them. They were heading to the new world when the collision with the iceberg shattered their dreams and hopes. There was panic, tears, and heart-wrenching goodbyes. Let's see how well you know the real story of the Titanic. The love story of Jack Dawson and Rose D. Wheat-Bucater is based on real events. What do you say? Is this a myth or a fact? The most emotional love story on the Titanic was actually fictional, created by the screenwriter and director of the famous film James Cameron. However, some of the passengers depicted in the film were real, and by pure coincidence, there was a Jack Dawson on board. His name was Joseph, not Jack, and he worked as a stoker's assistant. The most expensive item lost with the Titanic was a painting by Pablo Picasso. What do you think about this? This is a myth, another gift from the famous film, as well as the most expensive valuable item that probably sank with the Titanic was a painting by Mary Joseph Blondel, created in 1814. Among other valuable items were a violin belonging to Wallace Hartley, a musician who insisted on playing until the very end. There was also a 1912 Renault type, CB Chupi de Vilcar, which today would be worth millions of dollars. The manuscript by Joseph Conrad, the first edition answers Bacon's essay, 5 Steinway and Sons grand pianos, and of course, exquisite porcelain tableware and jewelry of first-class passengers. The Titanic was the largest and most luxurious passenger ship of its time. What do you think? That is absolutely true. In April 1912, the Titanic was the largest ship ever built, with a length of 270 meters and a maximum capacity of 435 people. This is not much compared to the largest cruise ship today, the Symphony of the Seas. It is only slightly longer than the Titanic but accommodates more than twice as many passengers. Perhaps no cruise liner has yet surpassed the Titanic in luxury. Its construction cost more than $200 million in today's money, and ticket prices were also quite high. First-class ticket prices range from $1,700 in today's money for a berth to $50 for one of the 2 luxury suites. Second-class tickets cost $700, and third-class passengers paid between $70 and $4,660. Most passengers of the unsinkable ship managed to survive. True or false? Unfortunately, this is false. Only 37% of all passengers actually survived the encounter with the iceberg. About 61% of first passengers, 42% of second-class passengers, and 24% of third-class passengers were saved. The Titanic was passing through the Bermuda Triangle when everything went wrong. Is this true or a myth? This is an absolute myth. The Titanic never even came close to the Bermuda Triangle. The liner sank about 650 kilometers south of Newfoundland, a considerable distance north of the Bermuda Islands. That infamous area where ships and planes disappear without a trace. Perhaps the sinking of the Titanic was due to the moon. True or false? This is true. The moon greatly influences the tides on Earth. The closer the moon is to Earth, the stronger the tides due to the increasing gravity of our satellite. In 1912, the moon was so close that it caused several icebergs in Greenland to break off. Massive chunks of ice that had broken off from the icebergs began to drift south. The time of the moon's approach occurred just 6 minutes after the syzygy tide, when the moon, sun, and Earth align, and their combined gravity reaches its peak twice a month. And the day before, our planet came as close to the sun that year as ever, further enhancing the gravity. Such a combination of events created ideal conditions for one of the most powerful tides in history. Icebergs that broke off from Greenland's icebergs drifted in the coastal waters of Labrador and Newfoundland, where they often ran aground. To move further, they needed to either melt and become lighter or catch a tide that would carry them away. In 1912, the tide was very high, so due to the huge number of icebergs, many shipping routes were shifted south, but not the Titanic's route, because it was considered unsinkable. It took the Titanic 4 hours and 40 minutes to sink. What do you say? This is false. And if you are an expert on the Titanic, you certainly know that it was actually 2 hours and 40 minutes. And this is quite a lot, given the damage inflicted by the iceberg. The ship's design slowed the flooding. The bottom of the ship had 16 watertight compartments. They worked like a lifebuoy. When the iceberg hit the hull, it punctured 6 compartments. The Titanic could stay afloat with only 4 damaged compartments. Water filled the first 6 compartments within an hour. At this time, the ship slightly listed to the starboard side. Water began to enter the 7th compartment, and from this moment, the rate of sinking increased with each second. The bow of the ship went underwater and the stern rose. One of the main reasons for the Titanic tragedy was the distress rockets. True or false? What is your opinion? This is true. When any ship is sinking, crew members should launch red distress rockets. This is a signal to all ships that someone is in trouble. But for some reason, someone put white lights in the Titanic's rocket box. When the ship collided with the iceberg, crew members launched white distress rockets. At this time, the steamer Californian was nearby. Its captain knew that the Titanic was passing through a dangerous iceberg area. The crew of this ship did not see the Titanic sinking in the dark but noticed the white rockets. Radio communication between the ships did not work. The operator of the Californian had turned off the receiver. The captain felt that something was wrong and sent a signal to the Titanic with a Morse lamp. But it was too late. The ship was underwater, so no one could respond. Another ship, the Samson, was drifting nearby with its lights off, as seal hunting is illegal. When the captain saw the Titanic's white rockets, he thought it was the Coast Guard, so the Samson quickly sailed away. Crew members realized they had abandoned the sinking passengers when they reached Iceland and heard the terrible news. In 1996, one expedition managed to raise the Titanic from the ocean floor. Do you believe this? If you don't, you're right. There were different ideas on how to raise the Titanic, from using compressed air to placing it in a wire mesh and covering it with liquid nitrogen or using giant magnets. The only real attempt to raise the Titanic was made in 1996, and it failed. The goal of the expedition was to raise a part of the ship's hull weighing about 21 tons. This would have been the largest piece to see the sun again if the operation had been successful. 4 large bags filled with diesel fuel were lowered to the ocean floor and attached to the hull plate. Then the bags of fuel were released, and they began to lift the part. When the weather worsened, the hull plate was 60 meters from the surface. The expedition participants decided to tow the part to calmer waters about 130 kilometers away. Long before they reached the towing site, half of the plate broke off and sank again. 2 lifting bags came off and the hull went to the bottom. Prolonged stay in 20-degree water will certainly not benefit you. And water at 10 degrees is just a nightmare. By feeling, it is much colder than air of the same temperature. The temperature of the water around the Titanic was -2 degrees. Even the iceberg with which the Titanic collided was warmer. The water did not freeze due to the high salt content. But what if the water temperature had been higher and the Titanic had sunk in warm water at about 50 degrees? This would have been possible if, on the day of the disaster, the waters of the North Atlantic had met with a warm underwater current from the southern part of the ocean. But even this warmth would not have been enough. The area of the ocean is too large, and the temperatures at night are too low. One warm underwater current would not have changed anything for the people overboard. But if the Titanic had sunk in another place at a specific moment, perhaps everyone could have been saved thanks to an incredible natural phenomenon. So, everyone on board, our journey to a parallel universe begins. A moonless night from April 14 to 15. The Titanic collides with an iceberg. Icy water floods the lower decks. The captain sends a distress signal. The nearest ship, the Carpathia, is 95 kilometers away. The Titanic, for maximum speed, the Carpathia, will take 4 hours to get there. That's a long time even for warm tropical waters, as the body still loses heat. The Titanic begins to sink. The command is given to lower the lifeboats. Some people jump overboard. The ship goes under, the lifeboats are gone, and you jump overboard with the other passengers. It feels like you've jumped into a giant iceberg. The water is so cold that you can barely move. You can't even scream because there is no air in your lungs. But at this moment, you feel a pleasant warmth coming from the depths. The warmth rises above your knees and then to your waist, and finally to your neck. You feel your muscles again and can breathe normally. The other passengers feel the same. The water gets a little warmer. Great, but a moment later, joy turns to horror. The ocean begins to bubble. And not from the high temperature. Something is rising from the ocean floor. You hear a heavy low sound coming from the depths. It's not the sinking Titanic, but something bigger, and a large piece breaks off from the melting iceberg. Bubbles appear on the surface. Suddenly, something hits your leg. Stones rise from the bottom, some of them quite large. People climb onto them like lifeboats. You also climb onto one of the stones and see the ship. It is no longer sinking, as the bubbling water pushes it up. You pick up one of the small stones and understand everything. It's pumice. Beneath the ship, an underwater volcano has awakened. Tons of volcanic rock rise to the surface. The volcano erupts, magma heats the water, and the seabed crumbles. At first glance, this does not lead to anything catastrophic. The enormous pressure of hundreds of millions of liters of water suppresses the volcano's power. The molten Earth's crust is pressed against the seabed, and pumice rises to the surface. And that's why this happens. The upper part of the Earth consists of different solid parts of tectonic plates. The plates collide and separate, and when one part separates from the other, magma immediately rises. All volcanoes are unstable places of fractures. If the Titanic had sailed over one of them during eruption, many would have been saved. Returning to the parallel universe, you see that the Titanic is sinking again. The water is no longer bubbling, the volcano has gone out, and the ocean is icy again. Fortunately, you have a lifeboat made of pumice. This will be enough to wait for rescuers. But let's imagine a situation without the underwater volcano and the iceberg. A situation where the water was warm from the start. One of the engines in the ship's engine room fails. Several pipes burst due to high pressure, and a crack appears in the ship's hull. Water fills the lower decks, the ship sinks, and people evacuate in lifeboats. It's a warm night and no one is cold. Everyone has life jackets. The ship breaks in two. You realize you need to jump. The Titanic goes under. Many passengers fall into the dark ocean in horror. The ship disappears into the darkness, and finally everything quiets down. A few minutes pass and you notice that no one is panicking. The water is warm. Almost everyone has a life jacket. Some people are swimming on wooden debris from the ship. After a couple of hours, the water no longer feels comfortable. The ocean takes the heat from your body. To warm up, the passengers form a tight circle, trying to get as close to each other as possible. Yes, you can endure another couple of hours until help arrives. People in lifeboats come closer and take those who are freezing on board. Passengers change places. 20 minutes in the water, then 20 minutes in the boats. It's very important not to take off your clothes. Even wet, they help retain body heat longer. And when it seems that everyone is saved, a scream is heard. A girl in the boat looks terrified. She is shivering with fear and pointing her finger at the black water. The passengers try to see what's there and notice a triangular fin. 1, 2, 3. There are so many. They are sharks. The sound of the sinking ship attracted a school of sharks, hoping to satisfy their hunger. They swim slowly. It doesn't seem like they are going to attack, but you need to keep your ears open, as these are bull sharks, one of the most aggressive and dangerous in the world. They are agile, fast, and unpredictable. They don't swim in the cold waters of the Atlantic. But in this parallel universe, the water is just right for them. These sharks create an illusion of slowness to make their prey relax. They are called bull sharks because of their short, blunt snouts, and they like to ram their target or other sharks with their foreheads. Several sharks ram the lifeboats. Someone falls into the water. Fortunately, people help the victims get back on board, and the sharks don't back down. Chaos and panic ensue. People scream and slap the water with oars to scare them away. But it doesn't help. You notice even more fins nearby. Now you see a large fin. A bull shark opens its toothy mouth and bites into the lifeboat. Then you notice even more fins. A school of great white sharks arrives. These are some of the most dangerous creatures on the planet. They are large, fast, and strong, and their 300 triangular teeth are sharp as a razor. The great white sharks scared away all the bull sharks. You fall from the boat and see a large fin approaching you. Fear awakens the instinct for self-preservation, and you try to swim away from the shark as fast as possible. It's useless, as the shark is much faster and will definitely catch you. You feel your leg touch the shark's nose. The other leg goes into the toothy mouth, and you scream in horror. A moment later, the shark releases you. Great white sharks rarely attack humans. Their favorite prey is seals. They simply lose interest when they realize you are not a seal. But if the shark is hungry, that's another story. Fortunately, your shark is not hungry. The passengers in the boats also have nothing to fear. The great white sharks do not attack. They just nudge the boat slightly out of curiosity. The great white shark swims away from you. But a bull shark appears. It looks very hungry. It approaches, opens its mouth, but then a loud ship's horn sounds. It's the steamer Carpathia which has come to the rescue. Everyone is saved. The sharks flee in terror. Back in our universe, another ship that was nearby could have saved everyone. But that's a completely different story. No one could have imagined that the unsinkable Titanic would collide with an iceberg, except for one person, William Thomas Stead. No, he didn't wake up one morning after having a vision of the Titanic's doom. He simply wrote a story called How the Mail Steamer Went Down in Mid-Atlantic, the story of a survivor on March 3, 1886, 26 years before the Titanic sank. Let's remember the main thing. The Titanic was sailing from Southampton to New York in April 1912. In the North Atlantic, it collided with an iceberg and, in less than 3 hours, completely went under. Of the 208 people on board, only 7 or 6 survived due to the icy water and lack of lifeboats. Another passenger ship, the Carpathia, heard the distress signal, picked up the survivors, and safely delivered them to New York. The story of William Stead is about a British sailor named Thomas who found himself on a passenger liner for the USA. At some point, the main character realized that there would not be enough lifeboats on the ship if something happened. A few days later, a thick fog hid everything around. Luck was not on the liner's side, and it collided with another ship, just like the Titanic collided with an iceberg. Only 200 out of 916 people made it safely to the USA. The main character managed to survive by jumping into the water and climbing into one of the lifeboats. You might think this story prompted everyone in the industry to fight for additional lifeboats on ships. But, unfortunately, when it was published, it received very little attention. What's even more unfortunate is that William Thomas Stead was on the Titanic when it sank, and he did not survive. Survivors who knew Stead said he was a cheerful person and liked to chat during meals. He praised the ship's design and sturdiness. Eyewitnesses also said that when the Titanic was sinking, Stead gave his life jacket to someone else. He was a journalist and was on his way to New York for a ceremony. Stead made a significant contribution to modern journalism by making it a rule to use illustrations in every newspaper article. He also conducted newspaper interviews, which are still used today along with illustrations. But this story was not the only work that predicted the disaster. Morgan Robertson, formerly a ship's captain, wrote stories and novels. His most famous novel was The Wreck of the Titan, also known as Futility. It was written in 1898, 14 years before the Titanic. This was a fictional story about an ocean liner, the Titan, which crossed the North Atlantic. It was described as the fastest ship, like the Titanic, and similar in size and design. In the book, it was described as unsinkable and the largest ship afloat at the time. The same was said about the Titanic. Another similarity was the limited number of lifeboats. The fictional story took place in April, and unlike Stead's story, the novel did not end with the shipwreck. It occurred halfway through the book. After that, the main character continued with his life. The book came into the spotlight after the Titanic's sinking. Many began to believe that Robertson had seen into the future. In reality, he just knew a lot about ships. It was easy for him to describe the essence of things without additional research. One of the biggest threats to ships at the time was a collision with an iceberg or other ships. The next story is even more mysterious. One day, Alex Mackenzie heard a voice telling him not to board the Titanic. Looking back, he saw no one. When the young man continued on his way, the voice spoke to him again. This time it was louder and more distinct. Alex took the warning seriously and decided to return home to Glasgow. Grandpa and Grandma were not too happy that he had cancelled the trip, as the ticket to the Titanic was very expensive. But their disappointment turned to relief when they learned that the ship had collided with an iceberg. John Coffey was a crew member of the Titanic but decided to quit when the ship stopped in his hometown of Queenstown. At the time, he was 23 years old, and quitting the voyage meant giving up a great career opportunity. However, a few months later, the young man resumed his service on the ship Maritime. So, it all worked out for the best. And now, a little about what could have contributed to the Titanic's sinking. Engineers claimed the ship was unsinkable, but later, there were suggestions that the steel in the ship's construction was too brittle for the icy water. Because of this, the rivets could not hold, and the ocean water seeped in. According to another theory, a fire broke out in the Titanic's hull 3 weeks before the voyage began. The fire softened the steel, allowing the iceberg to cut through it like a hot knife through butter. On some photographs taken before the ship set sail, black stains can be seen on the hull, which could have been caused by the fire. However, the iceberg would have caused significant damage regardless of whether there was a fire or not. Some believe there was a design flaw in the Titanic, with the lower sections made too large, causing them to crumple easily during the collision. Of course, these are all theories, but we do know for sure that the iceberg was the main character in this drama, and that the observations of Stead and Robertson should have been taken seriously. In any case, the sinking of the Titanic was a lesson for the future and helped prevent similar tragic events. By the way, ocean liners and passenger ships would not have existed if it weren't for Thomas Newcomen. In 1712, he invented the steam engine, which could generate enough energy to power a ship. And a century later, in 1819, the first steamer crossed the Atlantic Ocean. It took 29 days for the journey. The passenger ship industry boomed in the early 20th century when it became easier for people to travel to America or go on vacation. Time passed, and airplanes, which were faster and more efficient, replaced passenger ships. Now, a shipwreck in the open sea is a rare occurrence. Modern technologies allow detecting anything that poses a threat and even predicting stormy weather. Cruise liners today are giants compared to ships of the Titanic era. Today's ships accommodate almost twice as many passengers and are equipped with amenities that were once unimaginable. Most cruise ships today have several restaurants to suit every taste, swimming pools, and game rooms where you can have fun. If you're in the mood, you can listen to live music. And don't forget about the helicopter pad. If you suddenly feel unwell, onboard doctors are there to help. And ships will only get bigger. Perhaps one day we will have entire floating cities. You know the SOS signal, right? 3 dots, 3 dashes, and 3 more dots. It is an international distress signal using Morse code, which means save our souls or save our ship. The crew of the legendary Titanic desperately tried to send this signal for 2 hours on the night of April 14, 1912. Not far from where the Titanic sank, there were other ships, but for a long time the distress signals seemed to disappear before they were finally heard. The passenger ship Mount Temple received the signals and responded to them, but the Titanic never got the message. At the same time, it did not receive any signals from another giant, the transatlantic liner Olympic, which was about 800 kilometers away from the Titanic. At the same time, it was receiving signals from the passenger ship La Provence, which was not receiving any signals from the sinking ship. The radio equipment was acting strangely that night. Signals were either lost in space or arrived as unsolvable puzzles. The passenger ship Mount Temple eventually heard the signals and rushed to the Titanic's aid. However, the rescue ship ended up in the ice. It arrived at the last known coordinates of the Titanic, but the luxurious liner was nowhere to be seen. Were those coordinates even accurate? The passenger ship Carpathia was about 100 kilometers away from the site of the collision. However, the ship, Carpathia, which became famous for coming to the rescue, did not go to the right place at first. But strangely, the radio equipment was also damaged there. Outside that area, the Carpathia had no problems with the equipment. Back then, no one knew for sure how and to what extent the sun affects the Earth. No one could have imagined that the sun could disrupt the navigation equipment of huge ships. Even the Titanic, which was the best of the best at the time. Another theory suggests that even the moon could have played a role in this disaster. Some researchers believe that in January 1912, our natural satellite was closer to Earth than usual. This caused very strong tides and raised the sea level. Every year in Greenland, icebergs break off and usually drift near the coast of Newfoundland. But that year, everything went differently. Due to the rise in water level, their journey was delayed by 3 months. And in April, they found themselves on the route of transatlantic ships. One of these ice floes was the one that doomed the mighty Titanic. At the time, it was the largest ship, and it was considered unsinkable. But a few days after its maiden voyage in 1912, the Titanic disappeared beneath the waves of the North Atlantic. Of the more than 200 passengers and crew, only 706 survived that night. But what if the Titanic had been much smaller? And is the size of the iceberg really important? Would it have made sense to change course at the last moment? These 3 questions make us think. And what if the Titanic was considered an engineering marvel of its time? Designed by Thomas Andrews for the British shipping company White Star Line, it was just over 270 meters long and 53 meters high. It had 40 cabins, a swimming pool, a squash court, a gym, and 2 dining rooms. But it was under the deck that one of its most impressive features could be found. The hull of the Titanic was divided into 16 watertight compartments. As long as no more than 4 compartments were flooded, the remaining 12 would keep the damaged ship afloat. It was thanks to these compartments that the ship was considered unsinkable. Frank Cake, vice president of White Star Line, stated that there was no danger of the Titanic sinking. It was unsinkable and passengers would only experience minor inconveniences. But April 14, 1912, the Titanic collided with an iceberg. When the ice tore through the ship's hull, several compartments were ruptured, and within 2 hours and 30 minutes, the Titanic went down. Did the size of the iceberg that the Titanic collided with determine its fate? What if this iceberg had been smaller? Icebergs come in all shapes and sizes. They are chunks of ice that break off from glaciers and ice shelves in the Arctic and Antarctic and drift in the ocean until they melt. And they drift until they melt. One of the tallest icebergs discovered in 1957 was 168 meters high, practically the height of the Washington Monument. However, smaller icebergs can be just dangerous. Some of them are the size of a house and are called growlers. Others are the size of a car and are called burgee bits. Despite their smaller size, they can be more difficult to detect and can cause significant damage to ships. Even though they are smaller, much of their mass is still hidden underwater. More than 8% of an iceberg's volume is typically submerged. The sharp, jagged edges that are hidden underwater can cause significant damage to a ship's hull. It is very possible that the impact of a smaller iceberg under the same angle would have been enough to sink the Titanic. And if the iceberg had been larger, it might have been spotted earlier, giving the Titanic time to change course and avoid the collision. But the absence of this iceberg would not have guaranteed the Titanic's safety. The liner was traveling through a dangerous area of icebergs in the Atlantic. There was always the possibility of another iceberg lurking nearby. The ship's size was a problem when it came to maneuverability. It had just left port in Southampton, where it nearly collided with another ocean liner, the New York, missing it by just half a meter. The Titanic was clearly not designed for quick maneuvering and needed time and space to change course. However, when it comes to the confrontation between ships and icebergs, the size of the ship doesn't matter. The steamer Allender made voyages through the Inland Passage in Alaska. In the summer of 1901, it collided with an iceberg that tore a hole in its bow. The ship began to sink but did not do so immediately, and the crew tried to steer to a safe place. Eventually, its bow was completely submerged and the stern rose soon. The ship sank. Out of 168 passengers and crew, 128 survived. The most valuable cargo, worth 3 million, was lost. The length of the Allender's bow was 73 meters, almost a quarter the size of the Titanic. So, a smaller ship size did not help in a collision with an iceberg. In 1959, another ship, the Hans Hedtoft, known as the Little Titanic or the Danish Titanic, also proved to be unsafe. It was designed to be the safest ship with a length of 83 meters and a crew of 95 people. The Hans Hedtoft was designed to cope with most of the problems at sea. In addition to a double steel bottom, it had an armored bow and 7 watertight compartments. Despite all these features, it still sank. On its maiden voyage back to Copenhagen, the ship collided with an iceberg. When help arrived, there was no sign of the ship, only a lifebuoy that had washed ashore in Iceland months later. And again, the smaller size of the Titanic would not have guaranteed its safety in 1912. Finally, what if, regarding the last minutes when the iceberg was spotted and the distress signal was sent? The Titanic could have tried to completely shut down its engines, but it would have needed 800 meters to come to a stop, and the iceberg was only 280 meters away. Alternatively, the Titanic could have tried to avoid the collision by turning to the side. The captain gave such an order, but the attempt was unsuccessful, and the ship suffered a deep gash. And what if the collision had been a glancing blow? It might have made a difference. In this scenario, the damage would have been confined to the forward compartments. This means that the iceberg would not have torn through the length of the ship, but would have only punctured 4 compartments. This would have allowed the remaining compartments to keep the Titanic afloat. The ship would have remained afloat long enough for help to arrive. The steamer, Carpathia, would have had enough time to reach the scene and save all the people on the Titanic. One of the ship's engineers, Edward Wilding, made a similar statement during the investigation into the circumstances of the disaster. He claimed that most of the passengers would have survived a glancing blow, and that the Titanic might not have sunk at all. But others disagree. The special bulkheads on the Titanic were designed to protect the ship from collisions with other ships, not icebergs. These compartments would have crumpled upon impact, absorbing some of the force, while the rest of the ship would have taken the brunt. The damage would have been significant, but the remaining bulkheads would have kept the ship afloat. But an iceberg does not give like another ship. Most of the impact force would have been absorbed by the Titanic, leading to more significant damage. And the gash would have run along the length of the ship. Half of the bulkheads would have failed, and the ship would have sunk faster, with even fewer survivors. We may never know the answers to our questions. However tragic the Titanic's fate may have been, it led to changes that made sailing safer. In 1914, the International Ice Patrol was created to track icebergs in the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans so that ships could avoid them. In the USA and the UK, all ships were required to have enough lifeboats to accommodate every person on board. Regular lifeboat drills became mandatory, and the bulkheads on ships were designed to be watertight and not just sealed at the top. The story of the Titanic is a tragedy, but it helped prevent many other catastrophes. April 1912 marked one of the most horrific tragedies in world history. On that dark, moonless night, the engineering marvel of the time, the gigantic unsinkable Titanic, sank. At that moment, it had every chance to save all its passengers. Just a few kilometers away, there was another ship that could have saved the Titanic. But it did not happen. This was not some ghost ship or legend or theory. It is documented. There is a lot of evidence and eyewitness accounts. But why didn't the ship come to the rescue? Let's find out what happened that night, looking at the events from 3 different perspectives. And we'll start with the Titanic's version 11:30 p.m. The moon hides behind dark clouds. On the Titanic, everything is calm. Under the captain's guidance, the operator maintains radio contact with the mainland. At this moment, some stranger bursts into their tranquility, interrupting the connection. It is unclear what this strange person wants or what he is talking about. The operator doesn't even try to figure it out. He shouts at the man, demanding that he disconnect. The connection is interrupted. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic collides with an iceberg and the ice tears through the hole. Water begins to fill the lower decks. No one is panicking yet. At midnight, 20 minutes later, the crew sends a distress signal via radio. Few understand how serious the situation really is. 20 minutes later, at 12:25 a.m., the first response to the distress signal arrives. It is the passenger steamer, Carpathia. According to the captain, the ship is already rushing to the Titanic at full speed. However, it is 93 kilometers away from the disaster site, which means it will take 4 hours to arrive. At 12:45 a.m., the crew of the sinking ship launches distress rockets, and these lights become the last hope for many passengers. But we'll get back to that later. 90 minutes later, the Titanic's deck splits, and the ship goes under. At 4:10 a.m., the rescue ship, Carpathia, finally arrives at the scene. The crew makes heroic efforts to save everyone. They take 705 survivors on board. Then another ship, the Californian, appears. The Carpathia heads to the coast of New York, while the Californian searches the waters for passengers and finds nothing but debris. This ship was just a few kilometers away when the Titanic went down, and it could have saved everyone. But it did not. Its captain, Stanley Lord, committed one of the most heinous acts a sailor can do. He did not help a sinking ship. When the world found out, Captain Lord was hated. No company wanted to have anything to do with him. However, he never admitted his guilt. Before his death, he repeated that he was not to blame. If this is true, then what happened? And so we come to the version of the ship, Californian. Night of April 14. The Californian is sailing in the cold waters of the North Atlantic and encounters an area with a large number of icebergs. At 10:10 p.m., Captain Lord stops the ship. It is too dangerous to continue in this area as the ship could damage its hull. At 11:00 p.m., the ship lies in drift. In such conditions and with poor visibility, it is impossible to move. Captain Lord knows that the Titanic is heading this way, so he instructs the radio operator to warn the ship about the danger. The radio operator, Evans, turns on the receiver and tries to contact the Titanic. This takes about 30 minutes. Finally, the connection is established. At this time, the Titanic's radio operator is talking to the mainland. Evans interrupts this conversation and tries to warn the ship about the icebergs. The operator does not understand Evans's words. He is annoyed because Evans has interrupted his channel. He shouts at Evans and disconnects the connection. The exhausted Evans turns off the receiver and reports to his superiors about what happened. It remains a mystery how Captain Lord reacted to this news. Probably, he thought that the Titanic was aware of the danger, and he lets Evans go to sleep. If Evans had not turned off the radio and waited a little longer, he would have heard the distress signal from the Titanic. But he cannot be blamed, as he had no official reason to stay by the transmitter. Evans is too tired. His fatigue overcomes him, and he goes to sleep. The Titanic begins to sink. Its captain sends a distress signal. The operator on board the Californian does not receive this signal because its receiver is turned off. Captain Lord cannot sleep. He feels that something is wrong. Meanwhile, the Titanic is rapidly going under. Its captain launches the rockets. Remember, this is one of the crucial mistakes. For some reason, the crew forgot to bring red rockets on board and launched white ones instead. When sending a distress signal, red rockets should be used. Captain Lord sees the lights but does not interpret them as a cry for help. How could the largest ship like the Titanic not have ordinary red rockets? As it turned out, it could. Captain Lord decides that the Titanic is sailing away. Surely these white lights mean something, but what exactly is unclear. Captain Lord does not interpret them as a cry for help. He decides to signal the Titanic, but not by radio this time. He does not trust Evans and sends a signal to the Titanic using a signal lamp. It is important to understand that many old school captains did not trust radio communication at the time and did not understand its value. That's why Captain Lord did not wake up Evans. He sends light signals, but the Titanic does not respond. Many survivors later said they saw the flickering lights from the Californian, but no one could do anything. The ship's crew did not hear the cries for help. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic is completely underwater. A few minutes later, radio operator Evans wakes up and turns on the transmitter. He hears people talking about the sinking ship. Evans understands everything and informs the captain. The Californian immediately heads to the disaster site. There, it meets the Carpathia, which is sailing towards New York with survivors on board. The Californian continues to sail and search for people but finds nothing but debris. The Californian returns to the mainland, but the news about the ship that could have saved the Titanic spreads across the country. Captain Stanley Lord and the crew tell their version. They say their ship was stationary. Many do not believe them, and some of the surviving passengers say they saw the Californian sailing past. Nevertheless, the court finds them not guilty. In 1962, Captain Stanley Lord is very old. He calls a notary to make his final statement on the matter. He swears he is not guilty, but if it wasn't the Californian sailing past the Titanic, then who was it? The theory of the Samson can answer this question. The fishing vessel, Samson, is sailing in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. The crew is carefully examining the surroundings, but not because they are afraid of icebergs. The sailors are afraid of encountering the U.S. Coast Guard, as they are engaged in illegal seal hunting. At 12:45 a.m., Captain Sampson sees white distress rockets. The crew is convinced that it is the Coast Guard. The sailors turn off the lights and sail away. It was dark, so they did not notice the sinking Titanic. When they reached the coast of Iceland, they learned about the disaster and realized they had abandoned the sinking passengers. The nephew of one of the crew members of the Samson read about this story in his uncle's diary and asked permission to publish the notes. It became clear that Captain Lord was not guilty, but unfortunately by that time, he had already passed away. In any case, we still don't know who is to blame in this story. There were two ships near the Titanic. Their captains were adequate people and could have saved everyone. But they did not understand what the Titanic wanted in that dark night. Someone just forgot to put red distress rockets in the box. This small but crucial detail was one of the main reasons for the tragedy. On April 14, 1912, the dark night was filled with the terrible sounds of the giant metal ship sinking into the sea. The most famous ship of its time, the largest and most modern, was sinking. Someone might have saved it. The closest ship, the Carpathia, was only 93 kilometers away from Titanic, and it could have saved everyone. But it did not happen. Everyone on board was doomed. The engineers and passengers were all alone in the cold darkness of the night, far from land. The northern part of the Atlantic Ocean, about 50 kilometers south of Newfoundland, Canada. They needed time to figure out how to get people to safety. There was time, but it was not enough. If you watch the movie, you know that the ship did not sink immediately after the collision. The process of sinking took 2 hours and 40 minutes. The situation was dire. They needed to take care of 200 people, crew and passengers, and there was chaos on the ship. The entire crew began preparing the lifeboats to be launched into the water. There were only 20 lifeboats, which could accommodate 178 people. That was less than half of the people on board. First, they needed to get the women and children to safety. All crew members were instructed to prepare and launch the lifeboats. Over the next 2 hours, the situation became increasingly tense. Crew members were tasked with waking up the passengers, informing them of what was happening, and getting them into the lifeboats as quickly as possible. At 23:15 a.m., crew members sent a stress signal. The passenger ship Frankfurt was one of the first to receive the message and respond, but it was 315 kilometers away. Several other ships also received the signal and offered help, but unfortunately, they were too far away. At 1:20 a.m., the passenger ship Carpathia received the distress signal from the Titanic and immediately changed its course. At that time, it was 90 kilometers away. It would take more than 3 hours to reach the site. 20 minutes later, the crew launched the first lifeboat. There were only 27 passengers in it, even though it could hold 65. Many of the first lifeboats launched were barely filled. The crew was afraid that the lifeboat would not be able to hold the fully loaded lifeboat. At first, many passengers were afraid to leave ship. They were convinced that the Titanic was unsinkable and could not even imagine how the situation would unfold. The crew launched the first of 8 distress rockets. Unsuccessfully, everyone was far away and help could not come. In an hour and 20 minutes, 10 lifeboats had been launched. In lifeboat number 8, there were only 28 people. One of the passengers in lifeboat number 10 was Melvina Dean, who was 9 weeks old at the time. She was the last survivor. She passed away in 2009 at the age of 97. It was already 2 hours into the night. There were only 3 collapsible lifeboats left on the ship. But now it was clearly visible that the bow was sinking and the stern was rising above the water. Now it was obvious that the officer's cabin's collapsible lifeboat, in which there were more than 20 passengers, was being launched from the roof. When the bow of the ship went underwater, the lifeboat on the deck was washed away by the wave. It had 20 people in it, and it was partially filled with water. When crew members tried to straighten the collapsible lifeboat, it fell over. Before they could straighten the lifeboat, it was washed away by the wave. 30 passengers managed to get back into the overturned lifeboat. At 2:17 a.m., the radio operator decided to send the last distress signal. A minute later, the lights on the ship went out. The Titanic disappeared into the darkness along with everything that remained on board. But the night was filled with terrible sounds. The officer's cabin's collapsible lifeboat was never launched. Many passengers were left behind. The night was filled with the cries of those who were left behind. The ship continued to sink, and the sounds of chaos and despair filled the air. At 2:20 a.m., it was completely underwater. A few minutes later, radio operator Evans wakes up and turns on the transmitter. He hears people talking about the sinking ship. Evans understands everything and informs the captain. The Californian immediately heads to the disaster site. There it meets the Carpathia, which is sailing towards New York with survivors on board. The Californian continues to sail and search for people but finds nothing but debris. The Californian returns to the mainland, but the news about the ship that could have saved the Titanic spreads across the country. Captain Stanley Lord and the crew tell their version. They say their ship was stationary. Many do not believe them, and some of the surviving passengers say they saw the Californian sailing past less. The court finds them not guilty. In 1962, Captain Stanley Lord is very old. He calls a notary to make his final statement on the matter. He swears he is not guilty, but if it wasn't the Californian sailing past the Titanic, then who was it? The theory of the Samson can answer this question. The fishing vessel Samson is sailing in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. The crew is carefully examining the surroundings, but not because they are afraid of icebergs. The sailors are afraid of encountering the U.S. Coast Guard, as they are engaged in illegal seal hunting. At 12:45 a.m., Captain Samson sees white distress rockets. The crew is convinced that it is the Coast Guard. The sailors turn off the lights and sail away. It was dark, so they did not notice the sinking Titanic. When they reached the coast of Iceland, they learned about the disaster and realized they had abandoned the sinking passengers. The nephew of one of the crew members of the Samson read about this story in his uncle's diary and asked permission to publish the notes. It became clear that Captain Lord was not guilty. But unfortunately, by that time, he had already passed away. In any case, we still don't know who is to blame in this story. There were 2 ships near the Titanic. Their captains were adequate people and could have saved everyone. But they did not understand what Titanic wanted in that dark night. Someone just forgot to put red distress rockets in the box. This small but crucial detail was one of the main reasons for the tragedy. April 14, 1912, was marked by one of the most horrific tragedies in world history. On that dark, moonless night, the engineering marvel of the time, the gigantic unsinkable Titanic sank. At that moment, it had every chance to save all its passengers. Just a few kilometers away, there was another ship that could have saved the Titanic, but it did not happen. This was not some ghost ship or legend or theory, it is documented. There is a lot of evidence and eyewitness accounts. But why didn't the ship come to the rescue? Let's find out what happened that night, looking at the events from 3 different perspectives. And we'll start with the Titanic's version. 11:30 p.m. The moon hides behind dark clouds. On the Titanic, everything is calm. Under the captain's guidance, the operator maintains radio contact with the mainland. At this moment, some stranger bursts into their tranquility, interrupting the connection. It is unclear what this strange person wants or what he is talking about. The operator doesn't even try to figure it out. He shouts at the man, demanding that he disconnect. The connection is interrupted. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic collides with an iceberg, and the ice tears through the hull. Water begins to fill the lower decks. No one is panicking yet. At midnight 20 minutes later, the crew sends a distress signal via radio. Few understand how serious the situation really is. 20 minutes later, at 12:25 a.m., the first response to the distress signal arrives. It is the passenger steamer Carpathia. According to the captain, the ship is already rushing to the Titanic at full speed. However, it is 93 kilometers away from the disaster site, which means it will take 4 hours to arrive. At 12:05 a.m., the crew of the sinking ship launches distress rockets, and these lights become the last hope for many passengers. But we'll get back to that later. 90 minutes later, the Titanic's deck splits and the ship goes under. At 4:10 a.m., the rescue ship, Carpathia, finally arrives at the scene. The crew makes heroic efforts to save everyone. They take 705 survivors on board. Then another ship, the Californian, appears. The Carpathia heads to the coast of New York, while the Californian searches the waters for passengers and finds nothing but debris. This ship was just a few kilometers away when the Titanic went down, and it could have saved everyone. But it did not. Its captain, Stanley Lord, committed one of the most heinous acts a sailor can do. He did not help a sinking ship. When the world found out, Captain Lord was hated. No company wanted to have anything to do with him. However, he never admitted his guilt. Before his death, he repeated that he was not to blame. If this is true, then what happened? And so we come to the version of the ship Californian. Night of April 14. The Californian is sailing in the cold waters of the North Atlantic and encounters an area with a large number of icebergs. At 10:10 p.m., Captain Lord stops the ship. It is too dangerous to continue in this area, as the ship could damage its hull. At 11:00 p.m., the ship lies in drift. In such conditions and with poor visibility, it is impossible to move. Captain Lord knows that the Titanic is heading this way, so he instructs the radio operator to warn the ship about the danger. The radio operator, Evans, turns on the receiver and tries to contact the Titanic. This takes about 30 minutes. Finally, the connection is established. At this time, the Titanic's radio operator is talking to the mainland. Evans interrupts this conversation and tries to warn the ship about the icebergs. The operator does not understand Evans's words. He is annoyed because Evans has interrupted his channel. He shouts at Evans and disconnects the connection. The exhausted Evans turns off the receiver and reports to his superiors about what happened. It remains a mystery how Captain Lord reacted to this news. Probably he thought that the Titanic was aware of the danger, and he lets Evans go to sleep. If Evans had not turned off the radio and waited a little longer, he would have heard the distress signal from the Titanic. But he cannot be blamed, as he had no official reason to stay by the transmitter. Evans is too tired. His fatigue overcomes him, and he goes to sleep. The Titanic begins to sink. Its captain sends a distress signal. The operator on board the Californian does not receive this signal because its receiver is turned off. Captain Lord cannot sleep. He feels that something is wrong. Meanwhile, the Titanic is rapidly going under. Its captain launches the rockets. Remember, this is one of the crucial mistakes. For some reason, the crew forgot to bring red rockets on board and launched white ones instead. When sending a distress signal, red rockets should be used. Captain Lord sees the lights but does not interpret them as a cry for help. How could the largest ship like the Titanic not have ordinary red rockets? As it turned out, it could. Captain Lord decides that the Titanic is sailing away. Surely these white lights mean something, but what exactly is unclear. Captain Lord does not interpret them as a cry for help. He decides to signal the Titanic, but not by radio this time. He does not trust Evans and sends a signal to the Titanic using a signal lamp. It is important to understand that many old-school captains did not trust radio communication at the time and did not understand its value. That's why Captain Lord did not wake up Evans. He sends light signals, but the Titanic does not respond. Many survivors later said they saw the flickering lights from the Californian, but no one could do anything. The ship's crew did not hear the cries for help. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic is completely underwater. A few minutes later, radio operator Evans wakes up and turns on the transmitter. He hears people talking about the sinking ship. Evans understands everything and informs the captain. The Californian immediately heads to the disaster site. There, it meets the Carpathia, which is sailing towards New York with survivors on board. The Californian continues to sail and search for people but finds nothing but debris. The Californian returns to the mainland, but the news about the ship that could have saved the Titanic spreads across the country. Captain Stanley Lord and the crew tell their version. They say their ship was stationary. Many do not believe them, and some of the surviving passengers say they saw the Californian sailing past. Nevertheless, the court finds them not guilty. In 1962, Captain Stanley Lord is very old. He calls a notary to make his final statement on the matter. He swears he is not guilty, but if it wasn't the Californian sailing past the Titanic, then who was it? The theory of the Samson can answer this question. The fishing vessel Samson is sailing in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. The crew is carefully examining the surroundings, but not because they are afraid of icebergs. The sailors are afraid of encountering the U.S. Coast Guard, as they are engaged in illegal seal hunting. At 12:45 a.m., Captain Samson sees white distress rockets. The crew is convinced that it is the Coast Guard. The sailors turn off the lights and sail away. It was dark, so they did not notice the sinking Titanic. When they reached the coast of Iceland, they learned about the disaster and realized they had abandoned the sinking passengers. The nephew of one of the crew members of the Samson read about this story in his uncle's diary and asked permission to publish the notes. It became clear that Captain Lord was not guilty. But unfortunately, by that time, he had already passed away. In any case, we still don't know who is to blame in this story. There were 2 ships near the Titanic. Their captains were adequate people and could have saved everyone. But they did not understand what the Titanic wanted in that dark night. Someone just forgot to put red distress rockets in the box. This small but crucial detail was one of the main reasons for the tragedy.